Good morning. To non-Americans, to people outside the United States, it seems like there is a disconnect, an inconsistency between what people say on TV and in our government, what they say about China, and what the public actually is doing about China. The Chinese just recorded their biggest trade surplus in history last month, including with the United States. Every time we go to Walmart or Home Depot or to Amazon, we're loading up our shopping carts with lots of stuff that's made in China. So how to square all that with what our politicians and our cabinet officers are saying about China, our congressmen? After all, don't they represent American citizens? And here's our answer to that one. The Economist. America's trust in its institutions has collapsed. 20 years ago, Americans had the highest confidence in its federal government among the group of 7 countries. Now we're at the bottom. Here's Gallup, who surveys on these questions every year. And every year the numbers keep going lower. Do you have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in these institutions listed here? Small business, the military, and so on. The military, by the way, at 60% is the lowest they've ever recorded. Medical system at 34%, banks at 26%, public education 26%, large technology companies 26%, newspapers 18%, television news 14%, Congress at 8%. If a congressman gets on the TV news and says anything at all, it's raining outside, don't forget your umbrella, 92% of people will hear him and organize a picnic day at the beach. We know that the Inflation Reduction Act increased inflation instead. The Affordable Care Act made our health care and health insurance much more expensive and much less affordable than it ever was before. And it's no surprise to over 3/4 of Americans that when our Congress passed laws intended to destroy Huawei, that the opposite happened, because we're used to it by now. We assume that the Congress, who is distrusted by 92% of Americans, passed some laws to try to help our big tech companies, who are distrusted by 74% of Americans. So if you're not an American citizen and you don't care much for American institutions or the American government or our biggest companies, our education system, you've already got a lot in common with most of us, because we don't either. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal. The U.S. wanted to knock down Huawei. It's only getting stronger. 5 years ago, we cut off access to U.S. tech, and lots of people in the industry thought it would be the end of Huawei. Naturally, the opposite happened. It took Huawei a little time to get its bearings, and now they're stronger than ever. They've expanded into new businesses, they're making more money, and cut the U.S. out of its supply chains. Huawei is still number 1 in global telecommunications, and now they're taking over the smartphone business, along with cloud and semiconductors, could also add. Delete A is delete America. The United States government's campaign against the company is making it stronger. Huawei was once a lot more independent of the Chinese government, but not now. Every product going forward should be 100% sourced by the Chinese themselves. In an internal memo, Huawei's CEO said, America doesn't understand. They're turning their biggest friend into their biggest enemy, in other words. In the past, we chased the ideals. We wanted to serve mankind. Now we're going to make as much money as we can. Step 1, build out its own supply chain. Here we go again. Supply chains are China's lifeblood. Everything begins and ends right there. American business executives think very differently here. We say, if we have customers, we'll get the product. Marketing and branding and advertising comes first. China says that's all upside down. If we have the supply chain, we'll build the product and we'll get the customers. Our sanctions on suppliers to Huawei forced Huawei to develop their own supply chains. And once they did that, now they're coming after everyone else's customers. Delete America means just that. Go through every single supply chain in every single industry, not just telecommunications and Huawei's, all of them. And if there's an American supplier there, find a way to make it ourselves. The sanctions against Huawei not only failed to stop Huawei, in other words, but China responded by getting every foreign supplier out of every supply chain. Here the journal quotes Matthew Pottinger, who is the former Deputy National Security Advisor and now chairman at a big think tank. He's trying to spin all of this as a success. Restrictions on Huawei accomplished their mission, removing Huawei equipment from the networks used by the United States and by our military allies. The objective was not to put Huawei out of business. It was to protect our alliances and our data. So we passed laws that required major companies who did business with the national government to rip out all the Huawei-made equipment and replace it. These laws also apply to the United States military. These companies here, Huawei and ZTE, were singled out. And Pottinger is saying that the point of the sanctions was not, again, to put Huawei out of business, but just to get them out of our government networks. And that part has been successful. But that's not true either. Huawei is still in our communications gear for the government and for the military. Fortune and other tech journals detail this problem, which is that Huawei is just too big, and alternatives to Huawei are too expensive, even for our biggest government contractors. For major government contractors who are required under the law to remove Huawei gear, only 12% of them have actually done so, even though the law was passed more than 5 years ago. For the US military, the numbers are even worse. Our defense officials have gotten a waiver every year, and they're asking for another one this year. The Defense Department is saying that it cannot avoid doing business with Huawei. And when we go to our allies and tell them they need to rip out Huawei, they can't do it either. They have no alternatives that they can afford. The Pentagon needs another waiver to perform operations in the Pacific, in Europe, and in Africa. So this quote from Pottinger just justifies the cynicism, the lack of trust that huge majorities of Americans now share. He was Deputy National Security Advisor, so we know that he knows that Huawei equipment is still being used by the United States government and the United States military, and also by our allies. And now, thanks to these sanctions, Huawei is taking over other industries they weren't even in before. Delete America. Now, we're going to make as much money as we can. This is Lhasa, Tibet. Be good.
Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day